Okay. I'd like to thank everyone for being here for today's committee. First of all, I'd like to thank Mr. Perry for pointing out that our military did not lose the war in Vietnam. Just a minor point. It was lost when Congress stopped giving aid to South Vietnam, but our military never did a tremendous job. To me, this is a very important committee and a very important hearing because our military has way too many people or way too much focused on race. And when they talk about diversity, they're not talking about who is musically inclined or who is tall or who came from North Dakota. They're talking about race. The head of the new Joint Chiefs has said that their goal should be 42% white officers, which means, in other words, that if you're the most qualified person, but you're a white guy, you're going to have a tough time, a tougher road to hoe. DEI is a Marxist ideology, and the reason it's Marxist is they want to destroy America and they want to divide America. And one way to divide America is to have everybody not identify as, say, Mr. Lohmeyer himself. They want him to identify, I don't even know what your ethnic background is, Mr. Lohmeyer, comma, Hispanic American, or Mr. Lohmeyer, comma, Native American. And the Marxists realize that once we get that in America, where everybody thinks every election or every promotion is a battle between ethnic groups, we have destroyed America. And that is where we are going. I wish I would have brought up earlier, like I said, that new head of the Joint Chiefs says a goal should be 42% white officers. In other words, she's outright saying that we are going to discriminate against you because you're a white guy. She's outright saying that the person who gets the promotion is not necessarily going to be the best person for the job. And inevitably, it's going to create divisions within the military because it causes people to say, I should be promoted because of my background. Furthermore, this diversity thing, I suppose in some ways diversity is okay, but in other ways, I don't see what it has to do with anything. Okay, if we have two people applying for the Air Force Academy who both grew up in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, lived on the same block, both played on the football team, both played saxophone in the school band, but one of them has a Hispanic grandfather, well, all of a sudden, in order to increase diversity, that's the guy who's got to be promoted first, with the idea that they have diverse backgrounds or would bring something different to the military because one guy happened to have a grandfather who was born in Mexico 100 years ago is preposterous. But that is the ideology that is being pushed today and will inevitably destroy the military and will inevitably destroy America. So I'd like to thank you three folks for being here. I do not believe that forever, I sure hope Mr. Garcia is not right, forever we're in a position in which we define people by where their great-grandparents come from and believe that if this is not true, but if my grandfather was from Mexico, I don't speak Spanish, I've never been to Mexico in my life, but somehow, therefore, I have a unique viewpoint that I have to be promoted against other people in the military. That's ridiculous, and it's scary, and it's absurd, and I wish more people would say it, and I wish they'd call out people on what exactly they mean by diversity. How because I have an ancestor born in Thailand or something, it makes me a better sergeant. It's just absurd, but that's the ridiculous ideology that's taken over America. Okay, now with that and without objection, all members have 5 legislative days within which to submit materials and additional written questions for the witnesses, which will be forwarded to the witnesses if there are no further business. Without objection, I can't believe that people think it matters where my ancestors come from when we promote somebody. But okay, without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned. Thank you for all being here.
Mr. Grothman for his 5 minutes.
Hope I got the right one here. Good. A couple questions. We'll start with Ms. Gentles or Dr. Malkus, whoever wants to jump in here. What's been going on with math scores in this country over the last 40 years, say?
Over the long trajectory, math scores have been going up depending on the test you're looking at. The long-term trend from NAEP is a great measure of basic skills. They've been trending up until about 2012. At that point, we sort of hit the zenith. You can see this in a number of scores. In the aftermath, they started to decline a little bit. When the pandemic hit, they fell dramatically. I think it's important to note how they fell. They fell on average, but the students that were scoring sort of at the higher end of the spectrum, at the 90th percentile and the 75th percentile, those students did not suffer dramatically over the pandemic. Their scores came down. The students in the lower end of the spectrum, 10th percentile, 25th percentile, the floor fell out on their scores. If this was more even, what we would have is achievement gaps fixed, but everyone losing math progress, lower achievement than previous years. What we have is both lower achievement and larger achievement gaps.
So people are not doing as well in certain groups. In Wisconsin, which is the state I know best, probably the district with the largest share of people of color, students of color, is the city of Milwaukee. And we spend substantially more per pupil in the city of Milwaukee than almost every other school district in the state. Nevertheless, we get people running down the city of Milwaukee schools saying that you can't succeed or they're somehow inferior to other schools. Do you think it has a negative impact on students if they're constantly told their schools, particularly when it's not true, that their schools are underfunded or implying that they're less funded than other schools?
I think that there's a problem with constantly denigrating education, and I'm sure we can all agree that we don't want to be here to denigrate K-12.
I guess what I'm trying to get at here is there are people who imply that it's expected, I guess, or this is the reason why people of certain demographics don't do as well. Now, it's irritating enough that we actually spend more on those schools, but do you think when we talk about how we're down on people of certain demographics, it causes any defeatism in those students?
Well, we certainly don't want to have the bigotry of low expectations, something that we heard a lot during the Bush administration, that there were efforts underway to put that in the past, but certainly we have that again now that we're using the pandemic as an excuse for low performance among low-income students in particular. So we don't want to tell families from particular areas or particular backgrounds that they cannot achieve, that their students should not be expected to achieve.
Next question. I think part of this DEI stuff, insofar as we insert it in younger children, implies that if you're not of European ancestry, you're not going to do as well in this country. Now, from what I read, at least economically, people from Asia, being Indian, subcontinent, Chinese, Filipino, Cuban, even Nigerian, I think at least, I believe, I'm not sure about Nigerian, but I think, are doing better than Americans of European ancestry. Is this part of the diversity, equity, and inclusion curriculum? Are young people being taught how well people from non-European backgrounds, from China or Philippines, for India, are doing? Are you aware? Is that part of the curriculum?
That doesn't sound like something that would be part of curriculum, but we should be clear that even relatively affluent U.S. students do not score as high on math as average performing students in places like Japan or South Korea or Hong Kong. So all of our students are struggling.
Okay, I guess the point I'm trying to get to, are students from backgrounds, non-European backgrounds, doing better than average Americans? And are young people being taught that, or are they being taught how we're being too unfairly good to Americans whose ancestry around here goes back decades?
quite honestly, I'm not sure about the curriculum and contents in DEI indications. There's quite a number of differences between different groups, and my fear is that most of the curriculum is insufficiently demanding of students of European ancestry or what other group that we have of them to deal with the particulars of those arguments.
Thank you.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Ms. Ocasio-Cortez for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I don't know what I just heard right now, but I think when we talk about students of a certain demographic, you know, as a woman of a certain demographic, I would be happy to illuminate some of the disparities and discrepancies that we're talking about here. In fact, I wonder if any of my colleagues, anyone here, can articulate in this discussion of absenteeism. We say, you know, people aren't showing up to school anymore. It's because they don't. There's an insinuation that it's because people don't want to go, or there's a different attitude. But do we actually know what one of the leading causes of school absenteeism is? Asthma. Asthma. I represent the Bronx. I represent kids whose only meal that they'll eat in an entire day will be from school. I represent kids whose the cleanest air that they'll breathe in their entire day, maybe if they're lucky, will be from their school. That the safest place that they will be in a day will be their school. And so when we come here, we talk about schools. But if you close your eyes and put yourself in a classroom of someone else's district, you'll see that the challenges are different here. So this is not about what we're teaching about European versus non-European descent. This is about the fact that the Bronx has one of the highest childhood asthma rates in the country. And climate curriculum, and when we talk about the importance of having clean air and clean water, it has a direct outcome on people's scholastic performance. So if, as we transition in this time of a pandemic, a respiratory disease, and we wonder why one of the highest childhood asthma rate geographic zones in the country is struggling with absenteeism, knowing that respiratory disease is a major factor in that, maybe we try to solve that problem. Maybe we take a look at some of the environmental and some of the economic factors in getting to a school. Ms. Fort, you have extensive experience in this issue. Can you speak a little bit towards some of those economic and environmental factors that you see and how they affect communities and their ability to navigate educational outcomes?
It was green. Thank you for that question. At the Education Trust, particularly when you think about the pandemic, the research is clearly there that what impacted our students was healthcare, loss of employment of their families, the lack of technology accessibility, and this really had an impact on their livelihood, which of course had an impact on their school day. And as Representative Ocasio-Cortez pointed out, for many of these students, where they actually are supported best, where they are being able to take advantage of services and the supports that they need to actually succeed in school is at school, which we believe is the right place for many of these services. In addition, we know that lack of mental health supports that they faced during the pandemic needed to be supplemented while at school. And so we are happy to see from this recent investment of the American Rescue Plan, the significant investment in schools that helped schools reopen, that made sure teachers had the supports that they needed, and most of all, made sure that more children had support for mental health services.
Thank you so much, Ms. Ford. And this correlates with what we've seen, not just in the Bronx, but across the country. We saw admissions, mental health admissions of children that were highly disruptive. Their ability to be healthy is what can determine whether they show up to school and how well they do in school. On top of that, when we talk about social issues and when people want to critique social inclusion in schools, housing, as you mentioned, is a core underlying factor in how well someone does in school. If you don't have a home or a bed to lay your head on, how are you going to perform well in school? And when we talk about inclusion and those issues, one of the highest rates of childhood homelessness and one of the highest contributors and factors is if they're LGBT. Because if they go home to a place that will kick them out of their house because they are gay or trans or queer, how can we imagine them doing well in school? And so if school isn't safe for them, if home isn't safe for them, and if we allow a culture that continues to marginalize LGBT people to the point that their existence can't even be affirmed in school, how can we expect them to do well? And with that, I yield back.
The next thing we want to talk about, and I don't think has been adequately addressed, we reported on the tax bill yesterday. And I'm not sure you could call it a major bill. There were good things in the bill and bad things in the bill, as you can imagine, because it was part of negotiations between Republicans and Democrats. As I mentioned, the child tax credits probably have an element of welfare in them, which is bad. On the other hand, they did go to the middle class, and it was one of the few things that we don't phase out and say, because you're making $60,000 a year, we're going to take them away from you, we're going to punish you for working or punishing to get married. But there was another provision in there that I really disliked, even though I voted for the bill, because overall the positives outweighed the negatives. But it's a provision that was only in there because the press corps does not highlight it. And that's low-income housing tax credits. It's a little bit of a boring topic, but I asked the chair to indulge me a little bit. There are a variety of ways in which the federal government, it's none of their business to do it, by the way, but in which the federal government tries to provide low-income housing for people. And one is by giving a low-income housing tax credit to property developers of low-income housing. Now, we tweaked that credit for only a 2-year period and only a certain subset of that credit yesterday in the bill. But people ought to, or the press corps ought to talk a little bit about these credits, because I don't think that they would survive the light of day or survive appropriate attention by the mainstream media. My problem with them, in addition to my problem with all federal mucking around in low-income housing, particularly low-income housing that's not for the elderly. For the elderly, I guess I can say positive things about it. For the disabled, I can say positive things about it. But the low-income housing tax credit means that when the federal government gets involved, a huge beneficiary is, quite frankly, well-off property developers. And so you understand what happens when developers take advantage of the low-income housing tax credit. They get a credit equal to 9% of the total cost for a 10-year period. Because there's a time value of money, it means that when they build low-income housing, the government pays for 70%. In other words, if I'm a well-off property housing developer, the government gives me 70% of the cost of that building, and I only have to put in 30%. At a minimum, there are, I'm told, places around the country where the state and local governments give them further incentives. Obviously, the idea, and I think a lot of these people, by the way, make campaign contributions. I think they're politically well connected, as you can imagine, to take advantage of such a generous credit. But in any event, it is a very complicated thing. You might say, what happens if the property developer does not have income tax to offset with the credit? And what happens is then they sell the credits to somebody else, frequently banks, So we not only have beneficiaries of what is supposed to help with the low-income people go to an incredibly generous subsidy to property developers, but banks are able to use the credit to show the FDIC or whoever, the banking regulators, that they are socially conscious, so they get a little bit of a benefit there as well. There are some anecdotes I've heard about this. Oh, and by the way, an accounting firm puts out an explanation of the tax credit. Tax credit by itself kind of makes your eyes glaze over. People wonder where paperwork comes from. The accounting firm that puts it out devotes 1,400 pages to an explanation for a credit. Even if there are other things you like, you should know if Congress is passing a program that takes 1,400 pages to explain, you know it's a bad program. And I think, by the way, it's complicated on purpose, so you confuse congressmen into voting for it. Because the government, not surprising, is paying for 70% of the cost of that apartment in general costs 30% more than an apartment would if it was built in the private sector without having the government muck around. So right off the bat, there's a big problem there. I know a property developer in Wisconsin who builds normal apartments, not aimed for low-income housing, not taking advantage of the generous credit. He tells me that the people with the low-income housing credit frequently outbid him for the land because the government's paying for 70% of the cost. Think about that. So if you want somebody to build apartments for the middle class, they can't get the prime location in town because the low-income credit is so generous that the person with the low-income housing will always outbid them. Another thing that happens when the government pays 70% of the cost of something, you have a nicer apartment, because after 20 years it's no longer low-income housing, a nicer apartment that people who don't have low-income housing have. And I've heard that complaint. I've heard people looking for new apartments and they find the nicest apartments in town they're not eligible for because they're the low-income housing units, which of course is what happens when the government pays for 70% of the cost of the unit. Not to mention there's the possibility for crookedness there, because if the government is paying 70% of the cost of anything, doesn't it encourage your subcontractors and what to jack up the prices because the government's paying for 70%? Of course it is. Now, this new increase in generosity in the low-income housing credit will expire in 2 years. They were able to get this thing through because naive people thought it was, who first of all thought it was the federal government's business to get involved in all, but nice people felt that the low-income housing tax credit benefited low-income people. They didn't realize it was a payoff to well-connected property tax developers. But if the press corps would wake up and write articles about this program, it would not survive the next 3 or 4 years. The only reason this program, which I consider to be about the most questionable part of the Internal Revenue Code, the only reason this thing is able to survive is because the slumbering press corps does not report on it. Now, there are a lot of programs on it. I don't like to highlight one nonprofit, but the Cato Institution has a great expose of what this program out there, if you want to find it on the internet. It's about 5 years old, but it's as accurate today as it was then. And if we talk about it, if you think the Internal Revenue Code is used by well-heeled people to get things in there, this is for you. And I strongly encourage the press corps to pay attention to the low-income housing tax credits. And like I said, it's a waste of taxpayer money. And worst of all, I'm the type of congressman who tries to look out for the average guy. These are provisions stuck in the Internal Revenue Code to benefit the well-off, the politically well-connected, and just because they put a kind of a nice-sounding title to it, low-income housing tax credit, you think they're looking out for the poor. They're looking out for the well-heeled property tax developer. So there's the second thing that our slumbering press corps should pay attention to. The third thing I want to talk about is an issue we've talked about many times before, but since I last addressed the chair, we released the figures on the number of people coming across the border. Now, I had guessed the last time I was up here that for the first time ever, we'd have over 300,000 people a month crossing the border. I remind people that back in the days of President Trump, that number was, depending upon the year or depending on the month, around 10 or 12,000. So we've gone from 10 or 12,000 people a month crossing our border, what we'll call illegally, because I think they're asking for asylum they don't deserve, 10 or 12,000 to 300. This is just shocking. Whenever I look at it, I can't believe it. 370,000. So we've gone up about 30 times as many people crossing into the United States as we did 3 years ago. The American public ought to be absolutely appalled. And we have an administration, Joe Biden, who fumbles around and says, well, I guess maybe we should do something about that. Maybe Congress should meet with me and we should try to do something. The American public should know the fact that we've gone up from 12,000 to 370,000 has nothing to do with Congress. It's the inability of the Biden administration to want to enforce the law. This is something they want by design. They want, instead of 12,000 people coming here illegally every month, they want 370,000. And if they went back to the policies of President Trump, we are told just to stay in Mexico situation, we would reduce this number by 85%. Now, it'd still be over 50,000. We still have more work to do. It'd still be a disaster. But he could just, by the signing of a piece of paper, he could knock that 370,000 figure back down to 40 or 50,000. Pointing out other things that are going on that are the mainstream media is not doing a very good job on. In the 370,000, there were about, one more time, about 12,000 unaccompanied minors. Now, there's another thing that's gone up exponentially under this administration, and the mainstream media purports to care when families are separated. I'll tell you, when you have 12,000 people cross the border without the parents, that's family separation. Those kids should be turned around and sent back to their parents or contact their parents. Now, we don't do anything like that at all. If the child shows up and they've got a piece of paper on their T-shirt that says, "Deliver me to Uncle Joe in Portland, Oregon," we buy them the plane ticket, we deliver them to Uncle Joe. We don't do DNA testing to see if it really even is Uncle Joe. It's a recipe for human trafficking when people want to take advantage of young children, but the press allows it to happen. Under President Biden, they screamed about family separation when it was only a very temporary thing for a very small number of kids. Now you have 10, 11, 12,000 kids a month, no big deal. We don't talk about it. Okay. The next thing to remember is that even once these kids are placed with sponsors, the Biden administration does not follow up to see where they are. And estimates vary, but somehow, I think somewhere between 30 and 80,000 kids we've lost track of. In other words, we let 15, 14, 12-year-olds in the country, and after a few months, we don't even know where they are. So I would strongly encourage the press corps to report on the volume of people who came here in December. Even I, who am as opposed to the Biden administration as anybody, I was expecting that number to come in 310,000, 320,000. Instead, 370,000. They blew away the old record by about 50,000, more than I ever would have dreamed. And we have to remember, in addition to all the people coming into our country, changing our country, committing crimes in our country, in addition to that, we have a situation in which they are bringing drugs in the country. And we have to remember that over 100,000 of our citizens are dying every year from illegal drug overdoses. You would think anybody who cared about this 100,000, I know there's some hard-hearted people, they took the drugs themselves, we don't care. Apparently the Biden administration is in that category because they aren't doing much to stop it. But you would think any normal president, just to save the 100,000 lives and prevent all these drugs from coming to the country, would close the border on that alone. But the press, again, does not report it. I was old enough to remember the Vietnam War. In 12 years in the Vietnam War, 57,000 American troops died. And it was reported constantly and should have been reported constantly. That was news when our troops were dying in Vietnam. 57,000 over 12 years. Now we have 108,000 every year dying from illegal drug overdoses. It happens in county after county, and it's like swept under the rug because the mainstream media doesn't want to embarrass the Biden administration, so we don't talk about 108,000 people a year dying. And of course, any effort made to close the border, any effort made to prevent it? No. No effort made to prevent it. It's a story that every local newspaper in the country, if they're easy to find, they ought to be reporting not only the number for America as a whole, they ought to be pointing out how many people died, say, in the state of Wisconsin or wherever their state the paper is in. They should report how many people were dying in the county, and you will find out it is, I would think, for almost every county in the state, in the country, probably every county in the state. If you added up all the murders and all the car accidents together, the number of people who are dying of illegal drugs is way over that total. But we put car accidents with fatalities in the paper all the time because it's a tragic thing. People like to read about it or want to be informed about it. We put, obviously, local murders in the paper all the time. 108,000 Americans dying every year with spouses, with parents, with children. Let's sweep it under the rug, says the mainstream media. I'll tell you, if you put that in there, people would pay attention to those stories. Next issue that I don't think has been covered enough, and I'll talk about more next week, but we had a committee hearing on my subcommittee, one more committee hearing on wokeness in the military. Our current General Brown, who was previously head of the Air Force and now head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, prior to coming in the Joint Chiefs of Staff, publicly said that he wanted to reduce the number of officers in the military from 67% white men down to 43% white men. I walk around my district and I ask average people, I said, do you know the most important member of the military in the country has said his public goal is to reduce the number of white officers in the military from 67% to 43%? Almost nobody knows. The rest of the people are shocked. I told this to a Vietnam veteran who fought in Vietnam. I thought he was going to break down and cry right there when he found out what was happening to our military. They have taken the single most important agency in the United States and they run it like it's some stupid community college where it doesn't matter who we promote, where we don't have to pay attention to merit. Who cares? I can go to a cocktail party and brag about how many Hispanics or how many Asians or how many Native Americans are in the military. I no longer brag about how good my military is, how strong it is. I brag about how diverse it is. The press does not know what's going on here. And in my committee, there were inferences that we also were playing games with who gets into our military academies, West Point, Air Force Academy, Annapolis. Implication, and I nominate for those people like all Congress would do every year, but testimony was they're putting thumb on the scale as to who gets into these. It's just offensive. It's mirrored what goes on in other parts of the country. They pay people $190,000 a year to be diversity experts, to say, oh, this person is registered as this person's registered as that. I believe when they do it like they do in the private sector and have been doing this for 50 years. You self-identify, so we keep this fiction going that if you're 1/4 Peruvian, that you're a protected minority, you bring a diverse view of the world. I don't know why, if somebody has a grandmother who's Peruvian and grew up in Silver Spring, Maryland, you have a unique view of the world, and it's important to give you preferences to get promotion in the military, but that's apparently how we're operating right now. But in any event, all of the American public should be aware of that. If our military is not #1 in the world, we're going to be in big trouble, baby. One of the only reasons why we are #1 in the world is because we do have the strongest military of the world. And to begin to say our promotion should no longer be based on merit, but should be based on looking around and finding somebody from, I don't know, South Africa or whatever, is preposterous. Now, I'll remind the chair one more time that we're adding a new minority group to be given preferences to right now. President Biden wants North Africans and Middle Eastern people, if you draw a line from Morocco all the way to Iran, he wants them considered a special group who is in need of protection as well. So this will mean that if somebody immigrates here from, say, Egypt, and President Biden gets what he wants, they will also be considered a special case and need a special protection and being given preference over the native born. It's so divisive. Not only do you not have the best people necessarily getting the job, but it's so divisive because you are teaching our military rather than you're one. We're all one unit. We're all American. You're taking the military and say you should walk around with a chip on your shoulder. You're a Hispanic American. You're an African American. You're a Native American. You're an Asian American. You're a Middle Eastern American. And just the beginning of the end. I strongly hope when we come to the appropriations bill, and we made some progress, not as much progress as we wanted in the authorizing bill, but I hope that our team, when it comes to the appropriations bill, removes all of these horrible DPI positions. Our military, a lot of people tell us it's underfunded. I'm not sure that's true, but people tell us that to pay $190 grand a year for these people is, quite frankly, ridiculous. Now, and it's something that should be reported in the mainstream media. My fifth story that we're going to cover today that the mainstream media is going to not pay attention to is we had a prayer breakfast earlier this morning in the Capitol. In the past, we had that prayer breakfast outside the Capitol. We'd take a bus a mile away or rent something in a hotel. Today, we did it right here in the Capitol, which is fine, saved a few bucks, that was good. And President Biden came over, gave a little speech, which was good. But the main speaker was the chaplain of the Senate. And the chaplain of the Senate was very animated, gave quite a long sermon. But it was an interesting sermon because I believe he called for a fast of all Americans of once or twice a week. It wasn't a full fast. I think you could drink water. The fast would end every day at 3 o'clock. But nevertheless, I thought it was interesting that Reverend Black from the U.S. Senate, who claimed there are a lot of senators or members of the Senate, I think maybe he was mentioning staff too, who fasted frequently. And of course, he quoted several Bible verses in both the Old and New Testament in which the Israelis fasted. Jesus' disciples, after he left, were going to fast. I thought it was interesting that we had such a student of the Bible that the chaplain of the Senate, who's been here since 2003, was calling for fasts. I think it's something interesting and ought to be in your local newspaper if you want to know what's going on around here. I mean, it was a prayer breakfast. A significant number of U.S. senators and congressmen attended. The President of the United States attended. Wouldn't you think they'd cover it? I bet if I look in the mainstream newspapers tomorrow, the Washington Post, the New York Times, blah, 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 the Milwaukee Journal in my area, they will not cover the fact that the longtime chaplain in the U.S. Senate called for a fast. So those are 5 stories that have been underreported. We will ask if there are any members of the mainstream media that they see whether their newspapers covered them. And if the stories are even a little bit old, doesn't mean it shouldn't be in there. To me, if you're a mainstream newspaper, a citizen who reads you every day should be informed. And every one of these 5 issues, I think somebody who reads the Washington Post, the Philadelphia Inquirer, if that's still around, the Milwaukee Journal, would not know these 5 issues. I'm going to go through them again. degree to which people all around the world are looking to replace these Palestinians as far as doing work in Israel, the horribleness, the waste of the low-income housing tax credits, which would not survive, the mainstream media paying attention to it, what's going on at the border, the degree to which in December we just blew away any totals of people coming across here, and the degree that we have to do something, the wokeness in military, that's the fourth issue, the degree to which the current head of the Joint Chiefs overtly is saying that he does not want the best people running the military if they happen to be white, and that the chaplain of the Senate was such a Bible-believing guy that he called on the congressmen and senators who are there today to begin to fast, and he actually told us that a lot of the U.S. senators are already fasting. So I'd like to thank the chair for indulging me, and I would like to yield back, I guess.
From Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman for 5 minutes.
Thank you. We've had testimony before here regarding children who may be working overtime, maybe working late at night. If your department finds children who you suspect may be here from another country, which would indicate maybe shouldn't be here, what do you do about it? What's the follow-up with, say, a 16-year-old child who's working third shift?
Thank you, Congressman Grothman. I appreciate the opportunity to meet with you today. As you know, protecting children from illegal child labor is, in fact, one of our top priorities. And in the Wage and Hour Division, when employers are employing children in violation, our responsibility is to enforce the Fair Labor Standards Act. And so fundamentally, at the end of the day, employers have the responsibility for stopping illegal child labor, and we need to hold employers accountable.
Okay,
when they're violating the law.
if you find a child like that, okay, what do you do with the child?
So again, thank you, Congressman Grothman. We are focused on holding employers accountable and ensuring that they're complying with the law.
Yeah, what do you do with the child? I mean, if we have a child who is a minor and working illegally, do we call their parents? Do we say, do you know your child was working at the L&M manufacturing plant at 2 in the morning? Do you contact the parents?
So again, Congressman Grothman, we're responsible for enforcing the wage and hour laws and the child labor laws. But what we do, because we know that children are particularly vulnerable, and we want to make sure, and it's a responsibility of everyone across the community to make sure that we're protecting kids. We work very closely with community-based organizations. We work very closely with other types of agencies that provide services to make sure that kids have access to those services.
Do you make an effort to find that person's parents, to find out whether they're even living with their parents?
So again,
You don't consider that your responsibility. You just say, well, okay, we found little Johnny at 2 in the morning in the factory. We'll call some other agency, and we'll maybe send a nasty letter to the employer, and we just don't care if that 15-year-old even has a parent in the country. Is that your attitude?
So Congressman Grothman, I care very, very much, and I care very deeply about every child who's employed illegally in this country. And we, of course, work very closely with everyone who can provide services and meet the needs of those kids. But we also are holding employers accountable for employing children illegally in the first place.
Okay. There was an article in the New York Times. The Biden administration insisted it was a high number. So let's say there's somewhere between 35,000 and 85,000 unaccompanied minors in this country. By that I mean their parents aren't even here. And obviously some people they're living with somebody's making money off them. Does that concern you? I mean, I would think if I found somebody, maybe if they could barely speak English, working clearly illegally, even if they were, by all accounts, an American child, I would call their parents and say, what's going on? Why is Johnny at such and such a place at 2 in the morning? Now, particularly in light of the fact that, according to the New York Times, tens of thousands of these minors have been lost. We don't even know where they are. Don't you think the bureaucracy has some duty to find out who's taking care of these kids or if their parents are anywhere to be seen?
Thank you, Congressman. We recognize that many times there are children who are particularly vulnerable to child labor exploitation, and this could include, and recognize that this could include immigrant workers and
You make
immigrant
no
children.
effort to contact their parents. I guess that's the final question.
And Congressman, I just want to say that our responsibility is to both keep these kids safe and also to make sure that employers stop employing children illegally in this country.
Okay, well, if you aren't counting their parents, I don't see how you're making an effort to keep them safe. But we'll switch to another topic. Independent contractors. We all know, or at least should know, people are independent contractors and love it. Uber drivers are an example of people who love their job and brag about how much money they're making and blah, 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 blah. Your independent contractor rule, truckers would be another one, would prevent these American citizens, who used to mean you were free to do kind of what you want. They love this independent contractor arrangement where they have a lot of freedoms as to how and when they're going to work, make a lot of money. Does it bother you? You're taking the freedom to enter into these contracts, which the Uber drivers enter into. Does it bother you taking away from them, who should know what's best, for themselves, the ability to work as an independent contractor?
Thank you, Congressman. We're focused on addressing misclassification of workers who should get the protections of the Fair Labor Standards Act, but we very much recognize that independent contractors are running their own businesses or in business for themselves and are really an important
Insurance
part of the
agent,
economy.
does that bother you? If a smart PhD insurance agent, you take away his or her ability to operate as an independent contractor?
So, Congressman, again, in the Wage and Hour Division, we're focused on addressing misclassification of workers who have been misclassified as independent contractors, but we very much, and our new rule very much protects both employees under the Fair Labor Standards Act and independent contractors who are not covered by the Fair Labor Standards Act and are in business for themselves.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Dr. I can't read your name. Goldfarb? Okay. I have heard two physicians tell me that they feel American medicine peaked out about 7 years ago because of this, in part because of the issues we're talking about today. Do you think that is true? Are we seeing a decline in the quality of medicine?
Thank you for the question. I think what we're definitely seeing is a dramatic change in the character of medical education, which, if it hasn't played out yet in demonstrating a change in the quality of healthcare, it will in the very, very near future. And I think the issue is to make sure that we have the highest quality medical workforce that we possibly can have.
And that's no longer what we're emphasizing. Did you say that there is an ideology out there that it's important that, people of Asian ancestry have Asian doctors, and Native American ancestry have Native American doctors, and that is superior?
Yes, thank you for the question. This is the concept of racial concordance. And what this is really all about is the fact that there are real healthcare disparities in healthcare outcomes. And because of this, medicine, like any field that's enlightened, would seek to improve those kinds of disparities in outcomes. That is not a solution to the problem of disparities, because that's not the basis of healthcare disparities. And Dr. Green here next to me has conducted a study that's clearly shown that racial concordance, there's no evidence in the medical literature that
I would
benefits
think not.
patients.
I want to read, and I'm sorry for someone who's talking over you, but don't give us 5 minutes. So in other words, there's an ideology that says if I'm a Native American, I'd rather have a doctor who maybe got 30 or 40 points lower on the MCATs, but it was a Native American, rather than an Asian doctor who did superior on the MCATs, because is that what that ideology lives to?
Yes, that's basically the
You have to be really a sicko to really think that's the way we should operate our medical schools. That we would want a doctor who hasn't performed as well, but just because of racial reasons. I'd like to meet that person who would say, I'd rather have somebody with low MCATs treat me because they look like me. I mean, I assume there are a couple people out there like that, but that's just almost beyond belief. Next question. Dr. Smith, there is and I want you to comment on this, there's an ideology here in that what you bring to a job, today we happen to be talking about medical school or education, but it could be anywhere, is colored by where your ancestors come from, right? So if some guy's got a grandmother who was born in Norway and somebody else has a grandmother that was born in Honduras, that colors their world of view, or they'll be different, better or worse, or bring something different to the engineering firm or whatnot. What do you think about this idea that the way you think is determined by ancestors who you may never have met? Maybe the grandmother died before I was born, but still these DEI professionals want to break you out and say you're different.
DEI, undergirded by critical social justice, skirts individuality. It's all about group consciousness. Group consciousness is necessary for this ideology, because if we have individuals, then we have individual people with their own individual lives and histories that cannot be predetermined based on their skin color. So we have to look at somebody as a member of a group and not an individual. That's necessary for this to work. So with your example, it's about race. With other examples, it's about sexual orientation. With other examples, it's about ability. But everybody is a group member and not an individual, and that's the issue.
Right. You must hang around with these people or talk to them. What goes on in their mind? How, for example, they think somebody who's spent their whole life in the United States but had a grandmother from Honduras thinks differently, apparently, than, and I don't know what they do with people who are adopted, because they might not even know where they're from. I guess it's purely a genetic thing. But how do they justify that? Do they really believe that if I have a grandmother from Honduras, I view the whole world differently? Somebody who I've never met, sorry.
Yes.
Just quick answer.
Okay. It's a fabricated ideology based on standpoint epistemology, meaning that based on your race and your experience, you see the world differently than somebody else, even about objective reality.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like now to recognize.
Chair recognizes Mr. Grothman.
Yeah, we got a variety of things I'd like to go through, but first, Mr. Lynch complained about Mr. Galanis testifying from prison. So I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the Department of Justice's own press release announcing the sentencing of the Democrats' witness, Lev Parnas, to 20 months in prison for, among other things, making false statements.
Without objection on Donald Trump's partner. You're.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Chairman, we had originally hoped that we'd see a few more witnesses here today. They're not here, but I would like to run a brief tape because I showed up today hoping I'd be asking these witnesses a little bit more about this tape. I know that there's some mystery, or some people feel it's still ambiguous as to how this prosecutor was fired in Ukraine, and I wonder if this tape could do a little bit more to shed light on why that prosecutor was fired and why we want Hunter Biden and Mr. Archer here today.
So I got Ukraine, and I remember going over convincing our team, or others, to convincing us that we should be providing for loan guarantees. And I went over, I guess, the 12th, 13th time to Kyiv, and I was supposed to announce that there was another $1 billion loan guarantee. And I had gotten a commitment from Poroshenko and from Yatsenyuk that they would take action against the state prosecutor, and they didn't. So they said they were walking out to the press conference. I said, "No," I said, "I'm not going to, or we're not going to give you the $1 billion." They said, "You have no authority. You're not the president." The president said. I said, "Call him." I said, "I'm telling you, you're not getting the $1 billion." I said, "You're not getting the $1 billion. I'm going to be leaving here." And I think it was 6 hours. I said, "I'm leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money." Well, son of a bitch. Got fired. And they put in place someone who.
I just wanted to put that up there because I do eventually want further efforts made to get Hunter Biden or Mr. Archer here, because we have Joe Biden himself bragging that they got rid of a prosecutor who would have provided his son's business dealings with a little bit more tough going, or more observation. I'll put it that way. Now, Mr. Bobulinski, in previous interviews, in previous interviews with this committee, you said that Joe Biden not only knew about the family's business dealings, but enabled them and participated in them. You went so far as to say, it's clear to me that Joe Biden was the brand sold by the Biden family. Could you elaborate a little bit why you felt that way again?
Correct. That's one of the challenging things I've had to deal with over the last 4 years, with the focus of just simply telling the truth. The obfuscation around these facts are just beyond beyond insane. So I'll use a meeting at the Four Seasons Hotel in Washington, D.C. that I was not at, but apparently 8 to 10 Chinese executives of CEFC were at, with Chairman Yi and Director Zhang. Director Zhang I interacted with extensively. And James Gilliar was in that room, Rob Walker, Hunter Biden was in that room. And my understanding, based on Rob Walker's testimony, is that Joe Biden walked into that room, sat down, shook hands with people, and spent 5 or 10 minutes talking about his family, I guess. I was not in the room. People have tried to obfuscate that meeting like Joe Biden was walking in there to ask about the weather. And Rob Walker said that the Chinese didn't even know that Joe Biden was the former vice president of the United States, which is beyond absurd. The power that those 10 Chinese individuals had to go back to mainland China and say that they were in a room with Joe Biden is the value of what they were giving.
Okay. You stated that the Biden family concocted a scheme to give Joe plausible deniability. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, I would just point to all the different text messages and communications. They call him the big guy. I wasn't involved with Mr. Galanis or Mr. Archer, but they're giving you numerous data points. There was obfuscation. They didn't use his name. They used the big guy. You weren't supposed to talk about it. It was just,
Okay. And you personally met with the vice president?
I did twice.
Okay, and it was obvious. Did he say anything that indicates that you wanted him to help his son, that sort of thing?
Well, he thanked me for helping his son and his brother and asked me to keep an eye on them as I walked him out to his car after he gave his speech on the second meeting of the Milken Conference.
Okay, just one other follow-up, and this is kind of maybe a vague question, but I'd like to know it. One of the things that disturbs me about that is the interaction with the Chinese, or that's what we're dealing with today, but obviously other countries as well, that apparently in their own mind, the way you deal with the United States is the way you deal with say, a corrupt city council or something like that. In other words, you give them money and you get what you want. Do you want to comment on that, or did you hear any stories about that, or did you hear stories that they were surprised how easy it was to buy the U.S. government?
Well, I think it was time's expired, but answer the question. But please feel free to answer the question.
Yeah, I think CFC, and there's tremendous evidence, believed that they were bribing the Biden family, and they were doing it via Hunter Biden.
It's kind of shameful. Thank you.
Very good. Chair now recognizes Mr. Khanna for 5 minutes.
A Jewish member of the School of Social Work's faculty told the New York Times, quote, "When Jews speak up in our school, they are met with, 'You have white privilege, so shut up, you're a colonizer, you're an oppressor, you are reprehensible for the deaths of innocent Palestinians.'" You want to comment on that, and then I'll give you a comment on that, and how can you get this sort of rhetoric out of your faculty?
I find those remarks reprehensible, and I
How
would
does
not
this
agree
happen?
with them.
That's not the question. They're obviously indefensible. What is going on here? You guys talk about diversity. How in the world does this happen?
Congressman, there are 4,700 faculty at Columbia, and most of them
Please
are
speak
doing
up.
I said there are 4,700 faculty at Columbia, and the vast majority are dedicated.
Okay, I'll give you what I think the gist of the problem is. You guys talk about diversity. Could you give me a ballpark, School of Social Work, or your faculty across the board of your law school? How many you think are more on the Republican-leaning side, and how many are the Democrat-leaning side?
I am personally incredibly committed to viewpoint diversity. I am personally incredibly committed to viewpoint diversity, and is one of the things that I want to bring to Columbia. I do not know the answer to that because we didn't ask people. I honestly can't answer that because
How
I
many,
do
do you
not-
just in your own mind, could you rattle off like 10 Republican-ish faculty out of your 4,000 off the top of your head?
Yeah, I could actually, but you know, I did an event just last week with Joe Stiglitz, who's an economist, who's a Democrat, and Glenn Hubbard, who is a Republican. We have two of our fellows from our Institute for Global Politics who are former Trump administration
Let me give you another
officials.
question. On December 6th, the student group Columbia Social Workers for Palestine held a disruptive pro-terrorism teach-in inside the school's lobby, in which they said on October 7th, the Palestinian liberation fighters demonstrated their refusal to be dominated and called their effort a heroic struggle for libertation. Dean Melissa Begg initially canceled the event because of its advertising, but later she changed her mind and decided to have the event. Were any of these students disciplined, or what type of message do you think that sent?
I believe some of those those students were identified, and they went through a disciplinary process.
According to a current student, on October 10th, a request by Jewish students to the DEI office to designate a room to grieve the mass murder of Jews, something that should be perfunctorily agreed. Concern about the optics, given the lack of a similar room for Palestinian students, was it inappropriate to deny Jewish students their request? You think they should have been given that room or not?
Sorry, I couldn't hear exactly. Deny them access the room that they would requested to book? Is that the question?
You got to speak
Yes,
up.
I believe, yes. I think they should have been allowed, and I believe that was corrected later.
Why didn't you aim for a little more ideological diversity on your campus?
Mr. Grothman,
I have a
your
question.
time is up. Mr. Sublime.
Gentleman from Wisconsin, seek recognition.
I'd like to ask permission to speak for a minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
There's been a lot of question as to why President Biden, or a lot of people in my district wonder why President Biden continues to allow over 250,000 people in this country month after month after month. One of the speculations is that he, by letting people in here, eventually Congress will make them citizens, or their children or grandchildren become citizens, and they will change the nature of America. America is, of course, supposed to be a country built for a moral and religious people and a freedom-loving people. People who do not want a big government, people who want to vote for a limited government. It was of great concern that this morning I read an article about what's going on in North Carolina, and they found people who are here, not citizens, voting already. This is not surprising, I suppose. I should have thought it in the first place. You're giving a lot of these people driver's licenses. You give them some other form of identification. It's not surprising that some would slip through the cracks and vote before they had a chance to be educated on the limited government that is supposed to be the hallmark of the United States of America. I call on this body to crack down on people who are voting in our elections who are not yet legal citizens. Thank you.
Thank you very much. For what purpose does a gentlewoman from Minnesota seek recognition?
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Takano. Mr. Grothman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. One of my colleagues had a question on public service loan forgiveness, and you felt the program was broken because it was, quote, not being implemented the way you in Congress intended. By the same logic, will you admit that you broke the FAFSA, which Congress intended to be implemented in a timely and error-free fashion?
Yes, we have had significant delays that we're working tirelessly to implement correctly.
Thank you. Across the U.S., the number of students who successfully submitted the FAFSA was down 29% from this time last year, which is very significant. Has the department owned up to your mistakes? I guess you are, and taken responsibility? Should any employee, I guess let's say, should any employees at the Department of Education, political or otherwise, lose their jobs over the FAFSA rollout?
So let me just clarify, sir. The difference is less. We're about 15%. We've reduced the number from 30% to 15%, given our nationwide strategy that we're using. So we're seeing over 9 million students apply. The information is being processed, and students are receiving letters. So I just wanted to give you that update on that.
Okay. Did you chastise anybody, or was there any consequences for the?
Yeah, thank you for that question. You know, we take this very seriously, and it's concerning to us that there were delays. And yes, there will be opportunities for not only accountability, but restructuring to make sure that this doesn't happen again. As a parent of a high school senior and a student in college, I know how important this is for our families, and we're committed to getting it right and making sure we open doors to access to higher education for more students across our country.
Okay, Wisconsin has an impressive tech college system, and more people are going there all the time. We wish still more were going there, as opposed to our traditional university. These colleges offer flexible scheduling options, summer classes, and these are popular among the students. However, due to the obvious inefficiencies within your department, numerous students interested in summer courses this year are unable to access timely financial aid. During my conversations with my local tech schools in my district, reveal a lack of guidance from the Department of Education on how to proceed and advise students. Can you offer immediate guidance to these institutions?
Absolutely, sir. I'm committed to working with you and those institutions to get them the information that they need, the resources, and if necessary, ensure that we're funding FAFSA clinics for those students in that community. I think, you know, one thing that I want to share, sir, is, you know, in Wisconsin, there was a 61% completion rate of FAFSA prior to the simplification. Together, I know when we work together, we're going to do better than that. More students deserve an opportunity to access FAFSA and achieve their goals through higher education.
Okay, one of the major goals of President Biden has been some of the student loan forgiveness. And probably when I get back in my district, that's one of the major topics. And of course, the topic is brought up by people who have paid their student loans. You know, it's not unusual for people to say, do 2 jobs at one time. They're going to get that, clear the decks, get that loan paid off. And after they maybe get the loan paid off in 4 or 5 years, working extra hard, all of a sudden they find out that President Biden is looking, he would have forgiven them on his own. What would you like me to say to my constituents who have gone through maybe a given degree of hardship, or maybe just spent less money on other junk, and paid off their student loans that way? How would you respond to those folks?
Thank you, Congressman. Look, I'm one of those people who paid off my loans, and I'm recognizing now as secretary that over 1 million people go into default. What I would say to those folks is we are fixing a broken system that will allow more access, better return on investment for higher education. So we're fixing broken policies to make it, this is not something that will need to happen every 5 years. We're addressing it in different ways. So.
I'll agree with you there, but what I'm saying, in the past, broken or not, there are people who paid off their loans, maybe even paid them off prematurely because they didn't like being in debt.
Right.
Okay, maybe they worked extra hard, maybe they gave up other things you could do with your money, but they paid them off early, and now they feel like suckers for being responsible. How would you respond to that individual person? If I run into a guy or a parent of somebody who says, you know, my son worked 2 jobs, he paid off his loan, why in the world are these other people getting it paid off for nothing?
Well, I think, you know, it's important to recognize where we are right now. A similar case could be made for those who received PPP loans and got debt forgiveness with small businesses. They were given help at a time where it was tough. Right now, our higher education loan system is broken. We've introduced the SAVE plan. And quite frankly, people going into default in their community doesn't help the local economy. For the teacher that I spoke to who is now able to buy a home, that's helping the community. And if you look at our programs, it's public servants. It's people who were defrauded by their colleges. So we're taking the interest off of loans that have gone on for over 20 years. Thank you.
That wasn't really an answer to my question, but thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Grothman. Dr. Adams, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member and Secretary.
I yield back.
Okay, I guess I'll call on myself for 5 minutes. I'd like to talk a little bit about the Office of Refugee Resettlement. How many minors without parents do you know how many have been allowed in this country in the last 3 years?
Congressman, I don't have the precise number, but it's been over 100,000 over the last few years, each year.
How many each year?
Over 100,000.
Every year, so every year in this country, we let 100,000 kids in without either parent, right?
We process these children and they come to our custody because they're unaccompanied children.
Okay. Do you know how many you are keeping track of right now, or how long you keep track of? If a 14-year-old shows up at the border, how long do we keep track of them?
So to clarify the way this works, if a child crosses the border, does not have an adult supervisor, DHS, Department of Homeland Security, has 72 hours within which they must transfer that child into HHS's care because they're not equipped to handle children. We then will process the children, get all the information on the child. We then hold custody of that child as we work to find a sponsor who we vet, because by law, we're supposed to place that child in the most appropriate setting for children, and it's not in large congregate care. So we go through that process.
Percentage-wise, how many are going to another relative?
How many are going to a relative?
Yeah.
The vast majority.
Okay. Do we do DNA testing to make sure it's really a relative?
DNA testing is one of the tools we use to try to identify the individuals who are seeking to be
How
sponsored.
frequently, percentage-wise, do we do a DNA test?
It depends, because oftentimes we get some very credible information on the identity of both the child and the sponsor. And so if we need to do the confirmation, we'll go to something like DNA.
Do we know to this day where those kids are, whether they move on somewhere else? And even if it is a relative, say an uncle or whatever, do we do follow-up to see whether they're in an appropriate place?
Yeah, and as I tried to mention before, we have the records of the sponsors, and so we can reach out to the sponsors to find out about these children afterwards.
I think the New York Times once published something, and I don't quite believe their numbers, but
they're not correct.
But a large number, I will believe that tens of thousands of children are in this country, and we don't know where they are or who's taking care of them. Is that true?
So people talk about them being lost. That's all inaccurate. Remember that they are placed with a sponsor. We no longer have jurisdiction to follow up with them. We try, because we think it's important, best interest of the children, we make an effort to try to contact both the child and the sponsor 3 different times.
No. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, 3 different times. And the number that you're citing from the New York Times is based on the fact that some of those children and sponsors don't respond to us. We don't have the authority to make them respond. They're not lost.
That's of interest, though. I guess I'm for keeping families together, okay? And I'm going to give you 2 more questions.
Yes.
Do you feel that if somebody comes here without a parent, 14-year-old or 15-year-old, why don't we at least try to turn them back to their country of origin? Is there any reason why we don't do that? If a 14-year-old kid shows up, my parents aren't here, well, we're going to look for a foster parent. Why don't we send them back home where maybe their parents can take care of them?
Congressman, that may be the end result. The difficulty is...
Well, maybe, but why isn't it the norm?
Well, I can't say it's not the norm. What I can tell you is it takes so long to process the case of that child in immigration court that it could be 4 or 5 years before we finally decide what the status of the child will be, whether the child stays or whether the child goes back. Oh. And so it's the fact that the process takes so long that leaves this child in limbo.
I'm going to go ahead, one more question.
Yeah.
Even if in our country, if there's a divorce or something, our court system tries to keep both parents in contact with the child.
Yes.
It bothers me that when a parent shows up with one child in this country, we can allow them in this country rather than saying, hey, wait a minute, you're here from whatever country, you're from Brazil. Why don't we wait and you see if you can come here with both parents? We're not going to take a parent and a child and leave the other parent in some other country. When we wouldn't allow that, maybe even for a parent to move to a different state. Why don't we, at least in that case, try to keep the families intact?
You have struck on the problem we have with a broken immigration system. We can't do that because everyone is entitled to a due process hearing, and because it takes forever to hold the hearing, we can't get to the point of adjudicating to what you just said. That's the difficulty when you have a broken system that doesn't let you process all these individuals, not just the kids, but the adults as well. It takes forever to finally get justice, whatever that justice might be. It may be going back to the home country.
Dr. Adams?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Secretary Becerra, for testifying before the committee today, and certainly I enjoyed having you in my district.
Mr. Grothman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Yeah, first of all, just a little bit of a comment on some of these agreements that have been entered into. When we do these hearings, we're given something called a pre-hearing memorandum. And in the pre-hearing memorandum, it mentions in one sentence Johns Hopkins University, Harvard University, and the University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee. I think if you told the University of Milwaukee a year ago that they would appear in the same sentence as Harvard and Johns Hopkins, they would have been quite elated. And I'll point out that it wasn't such a great honor to be put in with those two institutions. In any event, I'll talk to Mr. Holloway. In your agreement with the Rutgers encampment, you promised to, quote, implement support for 10 displaced Palestinian students to finish their education at Rutgers. Do you acknowledge, or will you admit, that setting aside 10 spaces at Rutgers for Palestinians, if you agreed to, apparently in return for them stopping causing trouble and being, just being awful, would be a violation of federal anti-discrimination law? Did you consider that?
Supporting refugee students as a violation of anti-discrimination law?
Well, you set aside 10 spaces for Palestinians.
I understand. We have existing programs to support refugee students and scholars, and we would lean on those programs. And we absolutely don't believe in quotas, sir. But
do you see a problem here? I mean, first of all, on this whole Gaza situation, the Palestinians could not have taken a more outlandish position. But secondly, it appears as in response for the trouble they're causing and the hate that they're encouraging, their little ethnic group here is rewarded with 10 spaces. And I'm sure there are all sorts of other foreigners around the world who would be happy to grab those 10 spaces. Do you think that was a wise thing to do, or you think it's something you ought to maybe revoke or rethink?
Are you speaking specifically about the number 10, sir? Is that what you're asking?
Oh yeah, it could be 15, it could be 5, whatever, but it appears as though you're giving the Palestinian students support that perhaps you're not giving other students, and it appears like you're doing it as a reward or whatever for participating in this demonstration in support of Hamas.
I understand your question. I think it's a mischaracterization, but to your specific point about the 10 students, we have, as I said before, existing programs already that allow students, refugee students, getting to those threshold numbers, in this case 10, is a tremendous amount of work and may not happen, sir.
Well, you understand there are only so many slots in university. I mean, I don't know what's going on in New Jersey. You could have given the slots to people in New Jersey if you wanted to increase the diversity of your program. I'm sure there are many legitimate countries around the world in which students would be happy to come here. I guess the thing that bothers me is, first of all, you're violating federal anti-discrimination law, and secondly, you feel compelled to reward the Palestinians who were causing a disruption, and not to mention appear to be siding with an ideology that's completely offensive, but they get a reward.
To the various points you put in there, sir, Rutgers is one of the most diverse universities in the country, and we reflect
There's
the
a good
state.
question. I hate to cut you off, but we only got 5 minutes. You said it's a diverse campus. I think part of the problem with this whole thing is a lack of diversity on campuses. Right now, this country is about 50-50, Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal, or whatever. Do you think your campus is about 50-50 or 60-40 if I look at the faculty, Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative? Is it diverse like that?
Sir, I don't know. We don't have a political litmus test when we hire people.
You have no clue. I mean, when I talk to my local professors, they can give me scare stories about the infinitesimal number of conservative students. Well, okay, I'll go on here to the gentleman from Northwestern. It appears to me as though you have also entered into some sort of agreement in response to the troublemakers giving them, saying you're going to support visiting Palestinian faculty and students at risk. So in other words, you also have responded to these protests, obviously anti-Semitic protests or anti-Israel protests, by rewarding a subgroup here with special treatment. Do you regret that, or do you think that's inappropriate?
This is an existing program. It's not something new. We have an existing program, and it has served Ukraine, Afghanistan, and other countries.
The university will support visiting Palestinian faculty. That's what it says here. Well, thanks for cutting me off. Point out for 1 second, called America's Culture Revolution, in which they talk about this DEI obsession as being a successor to prior efforts of progressives or communists or what have you to divide America. And they failed to divide America by income level, so they are intentionally trying to divide America by race. The reason I believe that this is true is if you look at this time in our history, where people from all around the globe come and earn more than people of European descent. India, China, Cuba, Philippines, Iran, all these people come here, and within a generation they're out living people of European descent. We live at a time where single women under 30 out-earn single men under 30, but nevertheless we set up this big bureaucracy that says that if I'm a person of color and I inherited $10 million, I'm put upon and should be given preference over somebody who is of European descent who has virtually nothing. We have a bureaucracy in which if somebody comes here from Spain, they're considered an evil European and they have to be penalized. But if somebody comes from Spain, spends 2 generations in Cuba, and then comes here, all of a sudden they're put upon minority. The only way that makes any sense is if you intentionally want to divide America, and it's just so obviously offensive, and it must be confronted wherever we go. I also want to point out the left is very good at using words to confuse people. Earlier today, we were accused of conservatives being for censorship. I think when you don't want to have first or second grade kids reading graphical sexual things, that's not what I consider censorship. But in any event, according to a recent study by Bloomberg, and this is for Jonathan Berry up there, a recent study by Bloomberg, when looking at 2020 and 2021 data for 88 S&P 100 companies, it was found that 94% of new hires went to people of color or other minorities, only 12% European. This, in my opinion, could be the result of companies instituting race-based policies when it comes to hiring and recruitment. I hear that from all sorts of people in my district, by the way. There is no question if you talk to human resource professionals and they can speak off the record, this is happening big time. Mr. Berry, can you discuss how this data might support findings of illegal corporate race-based policies that violate the law?
Congressman, in the ordinary course, if you presented in court that kind of data where you have such a profound mismatch, presumably, between the demographics of who actually is hired and the relevant labor market, and then you couple that with the company's own explicit race-based policy, that's a layup. That's not a hard case. That is textbook racial discrimination under Title VII in many cases.
Okay, I'll give you another question along those lines. In President Biden's first year, approximately 3% of his judicial appointees were white heterosexual men. 3% in his first year in office. Could you comment on that? Would that be evidence of something going on here with the Biden administration?
It's potentially. The standards that govern the president's appointments are, of course, different than private employment. But again, you need to look at the relevant labor market, and here it's. I think that's something that would need a real look. Yes.
Yeah, well, I'm just saying when you have that degree, could you, any one of you, talk? And maybe this isn't exactly on point, but what effect does this pound on some young people that America is a racist country have upon certain groups? I can certainly understand how it empowers politicians, right? But in the classroom, when you are again and again told that in essence you're going to have a harder time succeeding. Obviously, people coming from other countries, India, China, Philippines, Iran, they don't have a hard problem succeeding. But on some groups may be counterproductive and be the reason why certain ethnic groups aren't doing as well because they keep being told that they shouldn't.
Congressman, good to see you again. I think you're exactly right. It's made to divide. It's made to make people feel inferior. There's no excuse for it anymore. We've been through it for so long now, other than really what you're talking about. It's intentional, and it's made to make us weaker instead of more unified, more patriotic.
Okay, I'll give you an anecdote and then let you comment on it. I was in a classroom, Zoom, and the teacher, white teacher, told a mixed-race classroom that black children made a higher percentage of kids arrested in that school than their total number in the school, and then told the kids that this was evidence of racism. What effect do you think that would have on a little boy or girl in the class who was African American if their teacher is telling them how racist America is and how racist the police is? Do you think that has any effect on their ability to succeed in society? I mean, I can understand how, and when a politician says it, it makes the politician more likely to get elected, but could you comment on that?
Congressman, just briefly, I would say that a lot of education that focuses on critical race theory has the perverse effect of either inculcating a victim mentality in a way that makes for all kinds of unhappy societal occurrences, exactly the kind you're talking about.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes Ms. Stansberry from New Mexico.
All right, well, start by saying that this hearing is making America less safe.
From Wisconsin.
Thank you. When this guy took the shots, he climbed a ladder to get on the roof, correct?
I'm unable to answer details of exactly how the individual accessed the roof at this time.
Do you know when if he did use the ladder, do you know when the ladder was placed there? Was the ladder there 2 days before, just the night before? Do you have any information at all as to when the ladder got there?
I would like to be able to answer those questions. The FBI is still conducting an investigation.
How did the rifle get to the roof?
Again, sir, at this time, I'm unable to answer questions to provide clarity.
Have they cleaned the roof since the assassination attempt?
Have they cleaned the roof?
Right. Has anything been done to the roof? Is it just like it was, 10 days ago, or not? Has anything been done to the roof?
I don't have an answer for that.
Okay. Were President Trump's normal agents normally assigned to him there that day?
Yes.
There was these were the same agents that were always there?
Yes, sir. The people that are assigned to his detail were working on that day.
Okay, there's stuff on the internet that says they were not there that day, but these are the same agents who are routinely there?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Do we know which agents fired the shots that finally took down the potential assassin?
Yes, sir, I do.
Can you give us those names or the background of those agents?
I would not offer their name up in this setting, but it was one of our technical officers, our counter snipers.
Okay, so can we privately get those names, the committee?
I am certain that we can make names available privately.
Okay. Do we know where all the shots landed? First of all, how many shots did that potential assassin, how many shots came out of the rifle?
So again, I would hesitate to offer that information as the FBI is conducting an investigation.
Have we got the bullets from all the shots?
Again, that would be the responsibility of the FBI to collect that evidence.
Okay. Do we have the correspondence from the shooter? Has that been recovered from his phone, whatever?
again, I would have to defer you to the FBI for details on that investigation.
Okay. You've spent some time trying to change the makeup of the Secret Service. Okay, you feel there are, whatever, too high a percentage are men. Does this affect at all who you are hiring for the Secret Service?
I've spent my time as the director trying to increase the number of people that we hire in the Secret Service so that we have the best and the brightest, and that's been my concentration as the director.
Okay, you ever not hiring men because of your desire to hit certain targets?
I am hiring the best qualified candidates that put in an application that want to work for our great organization.
Okay. Next question. The shooter obtained a direct sight of President Trump from the position on the rooftop. I assume that is not something that should ever happen. It should never happen. Do you want to elaborate a little on how that happened, or what you wish you had done differently, or would do differently next time there's a Trump rally?
Again, sir, the facts of this particular event are still unfolding. 9 days, there have been a number of reports that have been out there, so I do not want to provide information that perhaps would contradict something that has been erroneously reported or is not factual. But there clearly was a mistake, and we will take every effort to make sure that this never happens again.
Could you elaborate why you want 1/3 of the Secret Service to be women?
I've never stated that I want 1/3 of the Secret Service to be women.
30% or something. You had some target, no? Okay.
Well, gentlemen, yield.
Sure.